I found out I wasn't invited to my own son's Christmas the same way I found out my house keys no longer worked. Through a text message that felt so cold, it might as well have been sent from another planet. Mom, this year we're keeping Christmas small, just immediate family. My son wrote, as if I wasn't the woman who carried him for 9 months, raised him mostly alone, and worked myself sick to make sure he never felt less than loved. Immediate family. I stared at those words while standing in my kitchen, surrounded by decorations I had already started putting up for them. My hands shaking so badly I dropped an ornament and watched it shatter on the floor. And before I could even process that rejection, before I could even reply, another message came in, this one not from my son, but from his wife. Since you're not coming for Christmas, she wrote, we need you to transfer the $48,000 you promised for my new car by the end of the week. That's the moment I felt something inside me snap, and I need to know. Was I wrong for what I did next? Or would you have done the same thing in my place? Let me rewind, because nothing about this mess makes sense unless you understand how I got here. How my life slowly turned into a series of sacrifices that everyone else seemed to feel entitled to. I'm a 56-year-old woman, widowed for nearly a decade now. My husband died suddenly when our son, Daniel, was just finishing college. One moment we were planning his graduation party, and the next I was signing hospital forms with hands that didn't feel like my own. Losing my husband broke me in ways I didn't think I'd survive, but I didn't have the luxury of falling apart completely. Daniel still needed support, and I had to become both parents overnight. I went back to work full-time, sometimes overtime, took on freelance projects, and quietly sold off pieces of jewelry and keepsakes just to make sure he graduated without debt. I never told him how bad it got, how many nights I cried alone, because I wanted him to believe everything was fine. I wanted him to focus on building his future, not worrying about his mother. For a while, it felt like it was worth it. Daniel was grateful, or at least I thought he was. He called often, asked for advice, came home for holidays. Then he met Rachel. At first, I tried so hard to like her. I really did. She was confident, stylish, and very sure of herself. The kind of woman who walks into a room and expects it to rearrange itself around her. Daniel was smitten, and I told myself that was what mattered. But little things started to bother me. She'd make comments about my house being quaint, about my cooking being traditional, which felt like a polite way of saying outdated. She talked openly about money, about what Daniel deserved, about the lifestyle she expected. Still, I smiled, nodded, and kept my thoughts to myself. I'd already lost my husband. I wasn't about to lose my son by being the difficult mother-in-law. When they got engaged, things escalated quickly. Rachel wanted a wedding that looked like it came straight out of a luxury magazine. Daniel approached me one evening, awkward and nervous, and asked if I could help financially. He said Rachel's parents were contributing, and he didn't want to look like he couldn't provide. I looked at my savings, what little I had left after years of scraping by, and I said yes. I told myself it was a one-time thing, that this was my last big sacrifice, that after this I could finally think about my own future. I paid for part of the venue, the flowers, and the photographer. I watched Rachel accept my help without ever once saying thank you directly to me. Daniel thanked me, of course, but it was always rushed, like it was an item to check off a list. After the wedding, something shifted. Daniel stopped calling as much. Holidays became complicated. Rachel always had plans, traditions of her own, expectations that didn't seem to include me unless it was convenient. I started feeling like a guest in my son's life instead of a mother, and then came the car. Rachel had her heart set on a luxury SUV, something sleek and expensive, the kind of vehicle I'd never even test, driven because it felt irresponsible. One afternoon, Daniel called and casually mentioned that Rachel was stressed because her old car didn't fit their image anymore. I laughed, thinking he was joking. He wasn't. A week later, Rachel brought it up herself over dinner, talking about how family helps family, how she knew I had investments, how this would really mean a lot to them. I didn't agree right away. I said I'd think about it. Somehow, that turned into an assumption that I'd already said yes. That's how the number $48000 entered my life, hanging over me like a threat. I told them I couldn't just hand over that kind of money without planning, that it was most of my remaining savings. Rachel smiled tightly and said, "Well, we all make sacrifices." I felt small in that moment, like my entire life of sacrifices didn't count because I wasn't the one asking for more. Eventually, after weeks of pressure and Daniel telling me it would help their marriage, I agreed to help partially, thinking I could negotiate the rest later. I never agreed to a deadline. I never agreed to be treated like an ATM. But somehow, here we were. So when that Christmas text came, it felt like the final insult, layered on top of years of being taken for granted. Not invited, yet still expected to pay. I spent that night sitting alone on my couch, the glow of the Christmas lights mocking me, replaying every moment where I had put Daniel's happiness above my own. I wondered when I stopped being his mother and started being his backup plan. And as a woman who had given everything to her family, I had to ask myself a question I'd been avoiding for years. What happens when you finally say no? That's the situation I was in, emotionally exhausted, financially cornered, and painfully aware that the people I loved most didn't see me as a person anymore, just a resource. Before I tell you what happened next, I want you to pause and really think about it. If you were a mother, a woman who had sacrificed her entire adult life for her child, and you were told you weren't welcome for Christmas, but were still expected to hand over tens of thousands of dollars, what would you have done? Would you have paid just to keep the peace, or would you have finally drawn a line, no matter the consequences? Because what I chose to do changed everything, and the fallout was something none of us were prepared for. After that night, after staring at my phone until the screen went dark, and my reflection stared back at me looking older and more tired than I remembered, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed listening to the house creak, the same house where Daniel took his first steps, where my husband used to laugh too loudly during holiday dinners, where I thought I'd grow old surrounded by family. Instead, I felt like a stranger in my own life. By morning, I still hadn't replied to either message. Not my son's polite dismissal, and not my daughter-in-law's cold demand wrapped in entitlement. I made coffee, but it went untouched. My hands kept shaking, not with anger yet, but with a deep, bone-level sadness. I kept thinking, how did it get this far without me noticing? I decided to go back in my mind, replay everything slowly, because part of me still wanted to believe this was a misunderstanding. That maybe I had missed something. Maybe I was being overly sensitive. That's what women like me are trained to think, after all. Don't make waves. Don't be dramatic. Keep the peace. I remembered the first Christmas after Daniel got married. I'd asked weeks in advance what their plans were. Rachel had said, "We're still figuring it out." And then, 2 days before Christmas, I got a call telling me they'd decided to go to her parents' place out of state. No invitation, just an update. I spent that Christmas alone too, telling myself it was normal for newlyweds to prioritize one side of the family. The next year, same thing. Different excuse, different tone. Always polite, always distant. I also remembered how money slowly became a constant undercurrent in every conversation. Rachel would bring up how expensive things were now, how hard it was to maintain a certain standard. She'd talk about her friends' parents helping them with down payments, vacations, cars. Every story ended with a pointed look in my direction, like she was testing to see if I'd take the hint. And more often than not, I did. I paid for Daniel's phone plan longer than I should have. I covered emergency expenses that somehow kept happening. I even helped with part of their rent one month when Daniel said work was slow. Each time, I told myself it was temporary, that once they were stable, things would balance out. I didn't realize I was teaching them a lesson I never meant to teach, that my boundaries were optional. 2 days after the Christmas text, Daniel finally called me. His voice was careful, like he was walking through a room full of glass. He said, "Mom, Rachel showed me your message, or well, the fact that you didn't reply. She's upset." I almost laughed. I asked him calmly why I wasn't invited for Christmas. He hesitated, then said Rachel felt it would be awkward because of tension around the car money. I asked him if he hurt himself. I asked him if excluding his own mother felt like a reasonable solution to discomfort. He sighed and said he didn't want drama, that he was tired, that marriage was complicated. I told him grief was complicated too, and I'd managed not to punish anyone else for it. There was silence on the line after that. I brought up the money directly. I told him I had never agreed to just hand over $48,000 on demand. He said Rachel thought I had. I asked him why her assumption mattered more than my reality. He said something that hurt more than I expected. "You're better off than we are, Mom." As if that justified everything. As if years of careful saving erased decades of sacrifice. As if being a woman who didn't spend recklessly meant I owed everyone else my security. I told him that money was my safety net, that I was getting older, that I didn't have anyone to fall back on. He said, "You have us." I didn't say it out loud, but the irony nearly crushed me. After that call, I cried for the first time since my husband's funeral. Not quiet tears, but the kind that leave you gasping. I cried for the version of myself who believed unconditional love would be returned in kind. I cried because I felt foolish, and somewhere between the sobs, something hardened inside me. I realized I was grieving again, not for a death, but for a relationship that had already changed beyond recognition. I decided I needed clarity, not just emotionally, but financially. I pulled out all my documents, my bank statements, my investment accounts. I looked at the numbers honestly. If I gave Rachel that money, I'd be setting myself back years. Retirement would be uncertain. Emergencies would be terrifying. And for what? A car that symbolized status, not need. That afternoon, Rachel called me directly. "No greeting, no small talk," she said. "We need to settle this. It's causing stress in my marriage." I told her calmly that excluding me from Christmas while demanding money felt cruel. She said Christmas was about positivity and that my energy wasn't positive right now. I reminded her I was still Daniel's mother. She said, "And I'm his wife." The way she said it made it clear she saw this as a competition she intended to win. She told me if I didn't transfer the money, it would show where my priorities really were. That's when I realized she wasn't asking. She was testing how far she could push me. I told her I needed time. She said I'd already had time. I told her I wouldn't be pressured. She laughed, actually laughed, and said, "You don't want to damage your relationship with your son over money." I almost told her she'd already done that, but I bit my tongue. When the call ended, my hands were steady for the first time in days. I wasn't calm because things were okay. I was calm because I'd finally accepted the truth. No amount of giving would ever be enough for someone who only knows how to take. Over the next week, I noticed how quiet my phone was. No calls from Daniel. No messages checking in. Just one reminder text from Rachel with her bank details, sent like an invoice. That's when I started thinking about power, about how subtly it shifts when you're a woman who's always been agreeable. I thought about how my husband used to say I was too generous for my own good. I thought about how I'd taught my son kindness, but maybe not gratitude. And I asked myself a question that scared me more than losing them. Who was I if I stopped being useful? I started making plans not out of spite, but out of self-preservation. I spoke to a financial advisor for the first time in years. I asked hard questions. I looked at what my life could look like if I prioritized myself even a little. I even booked a small solo trip for the week of Christmas, something I'd never done before. It felt rebellious, like I was breaking an unspoken rule. Meanwhile, the pressure intensified. Daniel sent a message saying Rachel was crying, that this was tearing them apart. I wanted to ask why my pain never seemed to count in that equation. Instead, I told him I loved him and that I needed respect too. He didn't reply. By the time Christmas Eve rolled around, I realized something devastatingly clear. They fully expected me to cave. They believed my fear of being alone was greater than my need for dignity, and maybe, at one point, it was. But sitting in that quiet house, wrapping gifts that had nowhere to go, I understood that loneliness doesn't always come from being physically alone. Sometimes it comes from being surrounded by people who don't see you. And that understanding was the foundation for what I did next. A decision that would finally force everyone to see me not as a wallet, not as an obligation, but as a woman who had reached her limit. By the morning of Christmas Eve, the house felt different, like it was holding its breath along with me. I woke up early, not because I was excited, but because my mind wouldn't stop replaying every conversation, every compromise, every moment where I'd swallowed my feelings to keep the peace. I sat at the kitchen table wrapped in a sweater my husband used to love, staring at the blinking cursor on my phone where Rachel's last message still sat unanswered. Her bank details, no greeting, no Merry Christmas, just numbers, like that's all our relationship had ever been reduced to. And I realized something painful but freeing at the same time. I wasn't angry anymore. I was done. I decided to take a walk, something I hadn't done in weeks because stress had turned even small pleasures into chores. The air was cold, sharp enough to sting my lungs, but it felt good. It reminded me I was still alive, still capable of feeling something other than obligation. As I walked past neighbors' houses glowing with lights and laughter, I wondered how many other women were sitting inside those homes holding everything together quietly, unseen. How many mothers had been pushed aside once their usefulness was questioned. That thought stayed with me, heavy but grounding, because it reminded me this wasn't just about me being too sensitive. This was about a pattern, one I'd participated in for too long. When I got back home, there was a voicemail from Daniel. His voice was strained, tired, and it cracked something open in me. He said, "Mom, please, can we just talk? Rachel's parents already paid their part. Everyone's asking when you'll send the money. I don't know what to tell them." Everyone. Not me, not his mother, just everyone else whose expectations mattered more. I sat there listening to his message twice, then a third time, trying to hear the son I raised instead of the man standing in front of me now, paralyzed by other people's demands. I called him back. He answered immediately, like he'd been waiting with the phone in his hand. I told him I loved him. I told him that hadn't changed. Then I asked him a question that stopped him cold. I asked, if I didn't have this money, if I were broke, would you still want me in your life? There was a long silence, not a denial, not reassurance, just silence. He finally said, "That's not fair." I told him neither was being excluded from Christmas and still expected to fund their lifestyle. He said Rachel felt disrespected. I said I felt erased. He said he was stuck in the middle. I said I'd been in the middle my whole life and I was tired. That call ended without resolution, but something shifted after it. I no longer felt like I was begging to be chosen. I felt like I was choosing myself for the first time, and that's when I did something that might sound small, but for me, it was monumental. I sent a message not to Rachel, but to Daniel. I told him I would not be giving them $48,000 Euro 0. I told him I was willing to talk, to rebuild, but not under threats or exclusion. I told him I deserved to be treated like family, not a financial plan. My finger hovered over the send button for a full minute before I pressed it, my heart pounding like I'd just jumped off a cliff. The response came fast, too fast. Rachel replied instead of Daniel. She said I was selfish. She said I was punishing them out of spite. She said I was ruining their first Christmas as a married couple. Each sentence felt calculated to trigger guilt, to push the exact buttons she knew I had. And for a moment, it worked. I stared at the screen with tears in my eyes, that old reflex kicking in, the urge to apologize, to explain, to fix. But then I remembered the empty chair at Christmas dinner, the assumption that my presence was optional, but my money was mandatory. And I put the phone down. That night, alone in my house, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat in front of the tree. I let myself feel everything I'd been suppressing, anger, grief, disappointment, but also pride. Pride that I hadn't caved. Pride that I'd finally said no without justifying my existence. And that's when I want to pause and talk directly to you. Because this is the moment where everything could have gone a different way. If you were me, standing on the edge of losing your relationship with your only child, would you have given in just to keep them close? Or would you have held your ground, knowing it might cost you everything you thought you had left? Before I tell you what happened next, before I tell you how far this escalated, I want you to really think about what you would have done in my shoes and tell me honestly in the comments. Because what came next wasn't something I planned. It wasn't revenge in the dramatic, movie-like sense. It was a consequence, one that unfolded naturally once I stopped protecting everyone else from the reality of their own choices. On Christmas morning, I woke up to dozens of missed calls and messages, not from Daniel, but from relatives I hadn't heard from in years. Rachel had told her version of the story, that I'd promised money and backed out at the last minute, that I was bitter and controlling, that I was trying to sabotage their marriage. I sat there reading message after message telling me to do the right thing, to be the bigger person, to remember this is your son. Funny how being the bigger person always seems to mean being smaller. I replied to none of them. Instead, I did something else that scared me just as much as saying no. I told the truth. I wrote a long message, not angry, not defensive, just factual. I explained I had not been invited for Christmas. I explained the demand for money. I explained my financial reality. I sent it to the family group chat and then muted it. I didn't wait for validation. I didn't wait for permission. I simply refused to carry the narrative alone anymore. The silence afterward was deafening. Hours passed, then a message from Daniel. He said Rachel was furious. He said her parents were embarrassed. He said things had blown up. I asked him if he was embarrassed that his mother had been treated like an inconvenience. He didn't answer that. Instead, he asked if I could just send part of the money to smooth things over. That's when I knew this wasn't just Rachel's doing anymore. This was him too. His comfort mattered more than my dignity. And that realization hurt more than anything else so far. That afternoon, while families everywhere were opening presents together, I packed a bag for my solo trip. I left my house, my phone buzzing in my pocket, and drove away without answering. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt hollow and brave at the same time, because choosing yourself after a lifetime of choosing others doesn't feel good right away. It feels like standing in unfamiliar territory without a map. But I also felt something else, something I hadn't felt in years: control. I didn't know yet how deep the fallout would go. I didn't know how far Rachel would push, or how Daniel would respond when forced to choose between appeasing his wife and acknowledging his mother as a human being. But I knew one thing for certain as I watched the city lights disappear behind me. I was done sacrificing my future to buy my place in someone else's life. And that decision, as painful as it was, set the stage for the final confrontation that would change our family forever. I didn't check my phone for the first 3 hours of that drive. That alone should tell you how far things had gone, because I was the kind of woman who used to panic if I missed a call from my son. But as the miles stretched out in front of me, something strange happened. The tightness in my chest loosened just a little. I checked into a small hotel near the coast. Nothing fancy, just clean and quiet. When I closed the door behind me and locked it, I leaned my back against it and slid down to the floor, breathing like I'd just escaped something dangerous, because in a way I had. That evening, I finally looked at my phone. There were over 50 messages, some from Daniel, many from Rachel, a few from extended family. Rachel's messages swung wildly between rage and guilt. She accused me of humiliating her in front of her parents. She said I was trying to control Daniel by turning the family against her. She said I'd made my choice. Daniel's messages were shorter, more hesitant. He said things were bad. He said Rachel was threatening to leave for her parents' house. He asked me to please call him, not to apologize, not to understand me, just to fix things, like I always had. I didn't respond that night. Instead, I slept for nearly 10 hours straight, the deepest sleep I'd had in years. The next morning, I walked along the beach alone, watching families gather, couples laugh, children run toward the water. I expected to feel jealous or broken, but what I felt instead was clarity. I realized how long I'd been living in reaction mode, constantly adjusting myself to keep other people comfortable. And I understood that if I answered those messages without boundaries, I'd be stepping right back into that role. By the third day of my trip, Daniel finally called when I was ready to talk. His voice sounded different, softer. He told me Rachel had left to stay with her parents. He said her parents were furious with him, not me, because they felt the situation had made them look greedy. He admitted that my message in the family chat had changed the narrative. People were asking questions. People were uncomfortable. And for the first time, he said something I'd waited years to hear. He said, "I didn't realize how bad this looked until everyone saw it." I asked him a simple question. I asked if he thought it was right to exclude me from Christmas and still expect money. He hesitated, then said no. That single word hit me harder than all of Rachel's insults combined, because it meant he had known, on some level, that it was wrong, and he'd gone along with it anyway. I told him I wasn't asking him to choose between me and his wife. I told him I was asking him to recognize me as a person, not a resource. I told him that if our relationship was going to survive, things had to change fundamentally. When I returned home a few days later, I found an envelope taped to my door. Inside was a handwritten note from Rachel, not an apology, an explanation. She wrote about stress, expectations, pressure from her parents, how she felt like she had to secure her future. She said she hadn't meant to hurt me, but she also said she still believed family should help family. The absence of accountability was loud. Still, I appreciated the effort, even if it fell short. It showed cracks in the certainty she'd worn like armor. The real confrontation came a week later, when Daniel asked to come over alone. When he walked into my living room, he looked smaller somehow, like the weight he'd been carrying had finally bent his shoulders. We sat across from each other, the same couch where he used to curl up as a child. He told me his marriage was in trouble. He admitted he'd let Rachel take the lead in situations where he should have spoken up. He said he didn't want to lose me. I told him I didn't want to lose him either, but not at the cost of my self-respect. I laid everything out calmly. I told him I would not be giving them money for a car. I told him I was done being the financial safety net. I told him if he wanted a relationship with me, it had to be based on mutual respect, inclusion, and honesty. No more assumptions, no more guilt, no more silent punishments, he cried. I hadn't seen him cry since his father died. He said he was sorry, not I'm sorry you feel that way, but I'm sorry I did this. That mattered. In the weeks that followed, things changed slowly, unevenly. Rachel kept her distance. Daniel started calling again, not to ask for things, but to talk. We went to lunch, we argued, we laughed awkwardly. Nothing was magically fixed, but something toxic had been interrupted. I used the money I'd protected to secure my own future, to plan for retirement, to invest in myself for the first time since becoming a mother. And every now and then, when guilt tried to creep back in, I reminded myself that love should never require self-erasure. I don't know what the long-term future holds for Daniel and Rachel. Their marriage may survive, or it may not. But I know this: the moment I stopped paying to be included was the moment I reclaimed my power, and while it cost me comfort, it gave me something far more valuable, my dignity. Looking back now, months later, I can see the difference that moment made. I'm not perfect, and my relationship with Daniel isn't perfect either, but it's real. It's no longer based on obligation or fear, and that feels like the most important gift I could have given myself. I learned something crucial. Being a mother doesn't mean sacrificing your self-respect. Being a parent doesn't mean you have to finance everyone else's happiness at the cost of your own. And being a woman who has spent a lifetime giving doesn't mean you have to keep giving when the people around you have forgotten how to appreciate it. I feel stronger now, not bitter, not resentful, but grounded in the knowledge that I can set boundaries and that those boundaries are what protect love from turning toxic. So, if you've ever found yourself in a situation where people take you for granted, where your generosity is treated as entitlement, where family uses guilt like a weapon, know this: it's never too late to stand up for yourself. You don't have to wait until the betrayal is massive or the stakes are extreme. You deserve respect, inclusion, and the right to say no without feeling guilty. And that's exactly what I did. I drew the line, and it changed everything. If you were on my side while reading this, I want you to like this video, because every like is a reminder that standing up for yourself is valid. Subscribe for more stories like this, because there are so many women out there whose voices deserve to be heard. And share your final thoughts on this whole mess in the comments section. Tell me what you would have done if you were in my shoes. I'll see you all in the next story, and I promise, the next one will be just as intense and real as this one.